It is shortly after 11 p.m. on Saturday, September 11th, 1971. The City of London is settling into a damp, charcoal-grey slumber. Most of the capital's residents are asleep or finishing their final pints in the pubs of Marylebone. But inside a top-floor flat on Wimpole Street, a man named Robert Rowlands is not sleeping. He is sitting in the dark, bathed only in the amber glow of a vacuum tube display. He is twisting a dial, hunting for ghosts in the static. What he is about to find will spark one of the most frantic, high-stakes police mobilizations in British history. He is about to hear a crime happening in real time, involving millions of pounds, a thermal lance, and a vault full of secrets. But the problem isn't knowing that the robbery is happening. The problem is that in a city of 8 million people and 500 banks, Robert Rowlands has no idea where the voices are coming from. This is the story of the Baker Street Intercept. The static was a living thing. To Robert Rowlands, it possessed a texture, a grainy, shifting landscape of white noise that separated the mundane world from the ether. He sat, hunched over his equipment, the heavy plastic headphones pressing his ears, creating a seal against the silence of his apartment. Wimpole Street outside was quiet, the occasional taxi hissing over wet pavement, but in his ears, the world was alive with the chaotic buzz of the electromagnetic spectrum. Robert was a radio enthusiast. In 1971, this was a hobby that straddled the line between technical curiosity and unauthorized surveillance. His equipment was good, perhaps too good for a casual hobbyist. He appreciated the precision of the mechanics, the tactile resistance of the tuning knob, and the warm, distinct smell of dust burning off the amplifier tubes. He spun the dial slowly, drifting through the frequencies. He was looking for foreign broadcasts, the rhythmic pulses of distant numbers stations, or perhaps the late-night chatter of maritime traffic. He drifted past the commercial bands, pushing into the 27 MHz range. This frequency was the Wild West. It was technically reserved for specific low-power transmissions, but in practice, it was a dumping ground for unauthorized walkie-talkie chatter, toy radios, and interference. Usually, it was empty at this hour. Robert's hand froze. The needle on his signal strength meter twitched. It wasn't a broadcast. It was a voice. Close. Sharp. A bit more smoke. It's getting thick down here. Robert frowned. He adjusted the fine-tuning knob, clarifying the signal. The voice was distorted, clipped by the limitations of cheap hardware, but the accent was distinct. London, working class, strained. A second voice replied fainter, as if transmission power was low. "We're doing the best we can. The fan is on full." Robert leaned back in his chair, his leather upholstery creaking. This wasn't the usual chatter of taxi dispatchers or insomniacs. There was an urgency in the tone, a specific kind of physical stress. He glanced at the clock on his wall. 11:15 p.m. The first voice crackled again. Robert pressed the headphones tighter. Heat, smoke, fans. A third voice cut in. This one sounded different, clearer, arguably transmitting from a higher elevation. Robert's heart initiated a slow, heavy thud against his ribs. He knew that cadence. He knew what a lookout sounded like. This wasn't construction work. Construction crews didn't worry about blue Fords at midnight on a Saturday. He reached for a notepad and a pencil. His hands, usually steady when soldering circuit boards, trembled slightly. He wrote down the time. 23:17. The lookout said. The first voice complained. "Lance." Robert stared at the amber dial, a thermal lance, a tool used for cutting through reinforced concrete and steel, a tool that burned at thousands of degrees, producing immense heat and choking smoke. They were cutting into something. Robert stood up and walked to his window. He pulled back the curtain an inch. Wimpole Street was dark. He looked at the rows of buildings, stately, Georgian, impenetrable. Somewhere out there, perhaps within a mile, perhaps right next door, men were burning their way through a wall. He returned to the radio. The civic duty he felt was immediate, but it was warring with a distinct hesitation. He wasn't supposed to be listening to this frequency. To report it meant admitting he was monitoring bands that the post office, the regulator of radio waves, might frown upon. But the voices were continuing. "How much longer on the outer door?" "Don't rush me. You want to trigger the tremblers." Tremblers. Vibration sensors. Robert made his decision. He couldn't just sit here. This was a massive breach. He scanned his desk for his telephone. He dialed the number for the local police station, Marylebone Lane. The line clicked. A tired voice answered. Robert said, trying to keep his voice level, authoritative. There was a pause on the other end, the heavy silence of a desk sergeant who had dealt with too many drunks that evening. Robert said. The sergeant's tone shifted from bored to skeptical. The sergeant said. The skepticism had hardened into dismissal. Robert admitted. The sergeant sighed. Robert insisted, his grip on the receiver tightening. The line went dead. Robert stood there, the dial tone humming in his ear. He slammed the receiver down. The stupidity of it was staggering. He looked back at his radio equipment. The needle was still dancing. "Quote 30, the voice on the radio said. "Quote 31. They were still working. The police wouldn't listen. Robert realized that if he wanted anyone to take this seriously, he needed proof. His word wasn't enough. He needed to capture the ghosts. He rummaged through a drawer, shoving aside schematic papers and spare wires, until his fingers closed around a portable cassette tape recorder. It was a basic unit, a battery-operated device with a small microphone. He placed it next to the radio speaker. He pressed record. The wheels of the cassette began to turn, the magnetic tape hissing softly, ready to swallow the evidence. The voice from the vault said. Robert sat back down. He would record them. He would get every word, and then he would try again. 2 miles away, inside the sterile, fluorescent-lit corridors of Scotland Yard, the night shift was grinding through the usual Saturday routine. Pub brawls, domestic disputes, the occasional drunk driver. The atmosphere was bureaucratic and slow. But the ecosystem of the city was about to shift. Detective Superintendent John Williams was not a man who enjoyed surprises. He was a creature of procedure. He believed in the solidity of evidence, fingerprints, witness statements, physical timelines. Radio waves were messy. They were invisible. He was currently reviewing a case file on a series of warehouse break-ins in East London when the call came through from the communications room. Williams rubbed his temples. Williams paused. Most cranks gave up after the first rejection. Persistence usually indicated either madness or truth. When Robert Rowland's voice came through the line this time, it was different. It wasn't frantic. It was cold, precise. He was angry. "I am playing the tape now," Rowland said, dispensing with pleasantries. Williams held the receiver to his ear. Through the telephone line, recorded on a cheap cassette and played back through a radio speaker, the audio was atrocious, but the words were intelligible. "Slag is dripping. Watch the boots. Give me the hammer." Williams stiffened. He knew the sound of manual labor. But then came the kicker. "Is the detector off?" "Yeah, I cut the wire. We're clear to drill." "Mr. Rowlands," Williams said, his voice dropping an octave. "Don't hang up. I'm sending a car to you now. Do not touch that radio. Do not transmit. Just listen." "I'm listening," Rowlands said. Williams hung up and stood. He buttoned his jacket. "Get a car to Wimpole Street, top floor, and get the spectral analysis boys woke up. I want to know the range of a 27 megahertz portable radio in an urban environment." "Sir?" the desk officer asked. "You think it's real?" "They're cutting wires," Williams said, moving toward the door. "And it's Saturday night. The banks don't open until Monday morning. They have 30 hours. The patrol car arrived at Wimpole Street 20 minutes later. 2 uniformed constables, unsure of their assignment, were buzzed up by Rowlands. They entered the flat to find a man who looked like he hadn't blinked in an hour. Rowlands gestured to the radio. The constables looked at the equipment. It looked like a cockpit. One asked. Rowlands hissed. The radio crackled. The lookout's voice replied. It was the clearer signal. One of the constables leaned in. Rowlands corrected. The constable asked. Rowlands said, frustration leaking into his voice. The constable looked at his partner, then reached for his own personal radio, a police-issue UHF set. Rowlands lunged forward, grabbing the constable's wrist. The officer recoiled, hand dropping to his baton. "Watch it, sir." "Don't transmit," Rowland shouted. "They are on 27 megahertz. Cheap radios bleed. If you use a powerful police transmitter this close, you might interfere. Or worse, they might have a scanner. If they hear police chatter right on top of them, they'll bolt." The constable hesitated, looking at the intense fear in Rowland's eyes. He slowly lowered his radio. "All right, landline only." It was a small victory, but it established the rules of engagement. This was a silent war. By 1 a.m., Detective Superintendent Williams was standing in Robert Rowland's living room. The room was now crowded. Technicians had arrived, bringing bulky triangulation gear that looked out of place in the domestic setting. Williams was a tall man with a face that seemed carved from granite. He watched the cassette tape spin. He listened to the live feed. The thieves were arrogant. They felt safe. They were discussing the split. "My share. I'm buying a car," one voice said. "Shut up and drill," another snapped. Williams walked to the window. He looked out over the sprawling, light-polluted expanse of London. From here he could see the shapes of Marylebone, the dark void of Regent's Park to the north, the commercial density of Oxford Street to the south. "Range," Williams said. It wasn't a question. A technician looked up from a chart. He shook his head. Williams stared at the city. Williams asked quietly. The technician didn't answer. He didn't have to. Williams answered himself. He turned back to the room. The reality of the situation was settling over them like a shroud. A major heist was taking place. They were listening to it happen. They could hear the men breathing. They could hear the drill biting into metal. But the audio offered no GPS coordinates, no street names, just the echoing acoustic signature of a concrete room. Williams said. Rowlands asked. Williams explained. Rowlands countered. Williams admitted. The radio crackled again. The voice from the vault said. The exhaustion was palpable now. The lookout said. The room went deadly silent. Williams held up a hand. The vault voice asked. The lookout said. Williams spun to the constables. One of the constables rushed to the north-facing window. Another officer reported from the kitchen. The technician muttered. Williams clenched his jaw. The clue was useless without a visual confirmation. The city was too big. He looked at the radio set. It was a lifeline, but it was also a torment. Williams asked Rowlands. Rowlands said. Williams nodded slowly. He made a decision. It was crude, it was labour-intensive, and it was going to wake up half of London's police force. Get on the secure line to the yard, Williams ordered his subordinate. I want every patrol car in the A, C, and D divisions mobilised. I want them to run silent, no sirens. What are they looking for, sir? They aren't looking, Williams said. They are checking. I want a list of every bank with a vault within a 3-mile radius of this flat. We are going to have to check them physically, one by one. Sir, that's hundreds of doors. It's the middle of the night. We don't have the keys. We'd have to wake up the branch managers. Then wake them up, Williams snapped. Wake them all up. Check the front doors. Check the back alleys. Look for vans. Look for lights where there shouldn't be lights. He turned back to the window, staring at the endless rows of dark buildings. Somewhere out there, men were stealing a fortune, confident in their invisibility. They think they're ghosts, Williams whispered. But ghosts don't leave footprints. He turned to Rowlands. Keep recording. If they say a street name, if they mention a landmark, if they even mention the weather, I want to know. Rowlands nodded. He watched the tape spin. The investigation had begun. The police knew the what, they knew the when, but the where remained a terrifying blank space on the map. And as the drill in the vault whined again, high and piercing, Detective Superintendent Williams realized the terrifying truth. He was in a race against time, and he was running blindfolded. The city slept on, oblivious, but in the vault, the thermal lance was being lit again. More oxygen, the voice said. Let's burn this bastard open. The static hissed, the tape turned, and the hunt was on. The flare of the match Williams struck seemed deafening in the sudden silence of the flat, a sharp, sulphurous scratch that rivaled the static hissing from the speakers. He held the flame to the tip of a cigarette, his hands trembling with a contained, vibrating energy that had nothing to do with the nicotine and everything to do with the helplessness gnawing at his gut. He inhaled deeply, the smoke mingling with the stale air of the cramped room, a room that smelled of warmed electronics, wet wool, and the nervous sweat of 3 men crammed into a space meant for a solitary hobbyist. Rowlands, the ham radio operator who had stumbled upon this frequency by sheer accident, looked up at the superintendent with wide, terrified eyes. He was a small man, balding, wearing a cardigan that had seen better days, and he looked utterly out of place amidst the hard-faced policemen. He was a tourist in a war zone. "The thermal lance," Rowlands said, his voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might alert the voices on the tape. "That sound, it's a specific frequency, high-velocity oxygen and steel. They aren't just cutting a lock, Mr. Williams. They are melting through reinforced concrete or inches of hardened alloy." "I know what a lance is," Williams exhaled, the smoke streaming from his nostrils like dragon's breath. He turned away from the window, the dark, wet kaleidoscope of London offering no comfort. The young constable, Pringle, was huddled by the telephone in the hallway, the cord stretched taut to its limit. He was speaking in a hushed, urgent staccato, his hand cupped over the mouthpiece to shield the conversation from the sensitive recording equipment. Williams watched him, analysing the boy's posture. Pringle was green, but he was efficient. He could see the constable nodding, scribbling furiously on a notepad that was pressed against the floral wallpaper. "They're mobilising, Gov," Pringle whispered, stepping back into the room, careful not to trip over the serpentine coils of coaxial cable snaking across the rug. "Yard Control is putting out the call to A Division, D Division, and E Division. They're pulling cars from as far as Paddington and Holborn. But the desk sergeant, he asked for a priority target." "Tell him the priority is everything," Williams growled, pacing the 3 feet of available floor space. "Tell him I want every bank manager in Marylebone and Mayfair dragged out of bed. I don't care if they're sleeping in their pyjamas or halfway through a bottle of scotch. I want keys in hands and officers inside lobbies." "Yes, sir." Pringle retreated to the hallway. Williams leaned over Rowland's shoulder, staring at the mesmerizing spin of the reel-to-reel tape recorder. The magnetic tape moved with a fluid, hypnotic precision, capturing a crime that was happening in the ether, a crime without coordinates. "Can you clean it up?" Williams pointed a thick finger at the receiver. "The static, the background noise. Is there anything else on that channel? A dispatch rider? A taxi service? Anything that gives us a cross-reference?" Rowlands adjusted a dial with the delicate touch of a safecracker. "It's tricky. They're using a walkie-talkie frequency, likely something off the shelf, low power. The fact that we can hear them at all means one of 2 things. Either they are very, very close to this building, or one of them is transmitting from a high vantage point, bouncing the signal off the atmospheric layer." "A lookout," Williams realized, his eyes narrowing. "The man talking about the street. He's not in the vault, he's up high. Roof level." "Exactly," Rowlands nodded. "The transmission from the vault would be shielded by the ground, the concrete, the steel. It wouldn't propagate this clearly. But if they have a relay, a man on a roof with a receiver and a transmitter, he's the bridge." Williams moved back to the window. He looked up this time, scanning the roof lines of the buildings opposite. Chimney pots, television aerials, rain-slicked slate. It was a jungle of urban geometry. "If he's on a roof," Williams muttered, "he can see the patrols. If we send in the cavalry with blues and twos screaming, he tips them off. They drop the tools and vanish into the sewers or the tube lines." He turned back to the room. "That's why we run silent. We have to be ghosts, just like them." 3 miles away, deep beneath the pavement, the air was quickly becoming toxic. The vault was a tomb of reinforced steel and concrete, now filled with the acrid, metallic taste of vaporized iron. The man holding the thermal lance wore thick, darkened goggles, his face bathed in the shower of sparks that erupted from the contact point. The lance was a long, hollow steel tube packed with steel rods. Oxygen was pumped through it and ignited, creating a point of heat intense enough to liquefy almost anything known to man. "Ease off, ease off," came a voice from behind the sparks. This was the professor, the architect of the job. He was a thin man with nervous hands and eyes that missed nothing. He checked his watch, shielding the glass face from the flying grit. "The heat sensor. You're raising the ambient temperature too fast. If the thermostat in the ceiling hits 70 degrees, the silent alarm trips at the station." The man with the lance, a burly figure nicknamed Badger for his digging prowess, cut the oxygen flow. The roaring hiss died down to a splutter, then silence. The tip of the lance glowed a malevolent cherry red, fading to dull orange. "It's thick, Prof," Badger grunted, lifting his goggles. He wiped a mixture of sweat and soot from his forehead with a rag that was already black. "Thicker than the plans said. This isn't standard Treasury grade. This is private sector reinforcing. Manganese steel. It eats the rods." "We have plenty of rods," the professor said calmly, though his heart was hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He shone a torch at the scar in the metal. They were through the outer plate, but the inner mechanism was still shielded. "We need to finesse the locking bars. Don't just burn. Cut the linkages." From the corner of the vault, a portable radio crackled. It was the lifeline to the surface, to the eyes above. "Main drag is quiet," the voice from the radio said. It was distorted, tinny. "Bus just went by. Number 18, empty." "Copy that," the professor whispered into his own handset. "Keep your eyes on the side streets. The filth won't come down the main road if they're smart." He looked around the vault. It was lined with safety deposit boxes, hundreds of them, brass-faced and gleaming in the torchlight. Inside those boxes lay the secrets of London's elite. Cash, yes. Diamonds, certainly. But also leverage, blackmail, photographs. The professor wasn't just here for the gold. He was here for the power. "Let it cool for 60 seconds, the professor ordered. "Then hit the bottom hinge. We'll drop the door rather than cutting the center." "You're the boss," Badger said, reaching for a canteen of water. He took a swig, swilled it around his mouth to clear the metallic taste, and spat into the corner. "Just hope the lookout is awake. It's raining cats and dogs up there." At Scotland Yard, the communications room, the information room, or IR as it was known, was a scene of controlled chaos that was rapidly fraying at the edges. The room was vast, dominated by huge maps of the Greater London area spread out on tables like war plans. Men in shirt sleeves with ties loosened at the collars moved counters and markers across the grids. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and the relentless ringing of telephones. Chief Inspector Moore, the night duty officer, slammed a phone down into its cradle and looked at the dispatch sergeant. "Williams has gone mad," Moore muttered, rubbing his temples. "He wants a physical check of every bank in Marylebone. Does he know how many banks that is? There's a branch on every corner between here and Edgware Road." "He says it's a Code 1, sir," the sergeant replied, not looking up from his logbook. "Says he has live audio of a break-in. Heavy equipment." Moore sighed. He walked over to the map of D Division. Marylebone. It was a dense grid of high-value property. Embassies, doctors' offices on Harley Street, luxury flats and, yes, banks. Dozens of them. Lloyds, Barclays, NatWest, Midland. Moore said, straightening his back. He grabbed a grease pencil. Moore ordered. The radio dispatch operator, a young woman with a headset over her immaculately sprayed hair, began to speak into her microphone. Her voice was calm, the voice of the yard, projecting authority over the airwaves. On the map, the plastic counters representing the patrol cars, the pandas, and the unmarked Q cars began to slide toward the center of the grid. It was a net tightening, a slow, silent constriction around an unknown throat. Detective Superintendent Williams was not a man given to flights of fancy, but as he stood in the darkened flat, he felt a profound sense of dislocation. He was the conductor of an orchestra he couldn't see, listening to music played in a room he couldn't find. "Quote," he asked Rowlands. Rowlands shook his head, pressing the headphones tighter against his ears. Williams repeated. He grabbed the telephone from Pringle. Pringle dialed. Williams snatched the receiver. Moore's voice crackled down the line. "But it's London. There are vans everywhere. The street cleaners are out. The milk floats are starting their rounds. Check them all, Williams snapped. And more, check the empty shops. Empty shops? If they're tunnelling, Williams said, his mind racing, connecting the dots of previous cases, they didn't start in the bank lobby. They started next door, or 2 doors down. Look for a "to let" sign, a shop under renovation, something with whitewashed windows. He hung up. The logic held. You don't break into a vault from the street, you break in from the flank. You rent the basement next door, you pretend to be storing leather goods or wine, and you dig on the weekends. Williams whispered to himself. Suddenly, Rowlands held up a hand. The room froze. Rowland said. Williams leaned in, his ear inches from the speaker. The voice on the radio said. Williams' heart stopped. Gloucester Place. That was 3 streets away. 177. Williams shouted at Pringle. Pringle scrambled for the handset. Rowlands turned a knob, amplifying the signal. The lookout said, his voice relaxed again. Williams let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. They missed it. The patrol car missed it. But we know they are near Gloucester Place. That narrows it down. It has to be within line of sight of Gloucester Place. He went to the window again. Gloucester Place was a long, straight artery, running parallel to Baker Street. If the lookout could see it, he was likely on a roof between Baker Street and Gloucester Place. The net is shrinking, Williams said, a grim smile touching his lips. Rowlands, keep recording. Every word is a coordinate. Down in the vault, the atmosphere had shifted. The near miss with the police car had injected a spike of adrenaline into the crew. Too close, the professor hissed. They're patrolling heavy tonight. Maybe it's nothing, Badger said, attaching a fresh thermal rod to the lance. Maybe just a drunk and disorderly. No, the professor said, his eyes scanning the ceiling as if he could see through the concrete to the street above. That was a slow roll. They were looking. Someone knows something. He turned to the third man in the vault, a quiet, wiry mechanic named Dave who was manning the jacks. How much longer on the door? The bottom hinge is slag, Dave reported. Top hinge is holding. We need another 10 minutes of burn, then we use the hydraulic spreader. Once the pressure hits 5 tons, she'll pop. 10 minutes, the professor calculated. 10 minutes is a lifetime. He grabbed the radio. Eagle, this is Mole. Keep your head down. If you see anything at all, that looks like a coordinated approach, you blow the whistle. We leave the gear and we run. Understood? Understood, Mole, came the reply. Rain is getting heavier. Visibility is dropping. Helps us. The professor turned back to the safe. The majestic, impenetrable door of the vault stood before them, a silent sentinel guarding millions. It was scarred and blackened now, weeping molten metal onto the floor. It was wounded. Light it up, the professor ordered. Let's finish this. Badger struck the igniter. The lance roared back to life, a dragon screaming in a cave. The light was blinding, casting long, dancing shadows against the walls of safety deposit boxes. The temperature in the room began to climb instantly. On the street, Constable Peter Evans was driving Panda Car 44, a bruised and battered Morris Minor that smelled of damp upholstery and floor polish. His partner, Sergeant Miller, was in the passenger seat, peering out through the rain-streaked window. "This is a needle in a haystack, Sarge," Evans complained, wrestling the steering wheel as they turned off Marylebone Road. "Williams has got a bee in his bonnet. Check the banks." "Which one? There's a bank here. There's one over there." He gestured vaguely at the dark facades. "Just drive, Evans," Miller said, wiping condensation from the glass with his sleeve. "You heard the radio. They're listening. Someone's cracking a crib right now." They rolled slowly down Baker Street. The streetlights reflected in the puddles, creating pools of orange oil on the tarmac. The city was asleep, a dark leviathan of brick and stone. "Look at that," Miller said, pointing. "What?" "That shop, the leather goods place, Le Sac. Didn't that used to be a chicken restaurant?" "I think so. Changed hands last month." "Windows are whitewashed," Miller noted. "Renovations." Evans slowed the car. "You want to check it?" Miller hesitated. He looked at the shop front. It was dark, silent. The padlock on the front grille was secure. There was no sign of life, no light leaking from the edges of the door. Nah, Miller decided, settling back into his seat. If they were in there, there'd be a van, a getaway car, streets empty. Evans accelerated gently. Right you are, Sarge. Moving on to the Lloyds branch. They drove past the shop. As they did, the radio in their car crackled with a burst of static, momentarily interfering with the police frequency. Atmospherics, Evans muttered, twisting the squelch knob. Inside the shop, just 6 feet below where their tires had rolled, a man was standing at the bottom of a freshly dug tunnel, holding a timber support beam that was shaking from the vibration of the passing car. He held his breath until the rumble faded. Coast clear, he whispered into the darkness of the tunnel. Get back to work. Back in the flat, time was becoming a physical weight. Every minute that ticked by on the clock on the mantelpiece was a minute the thieves were closer to the money and closer to escape. Williams was now sitting on the floor, surrounded by maps he had pulled from his briefcase. He was triangulating. Rowlands, he said, not looking up. You said the signal was strong, ground wave strong. Yes. And the lookout saw a car on Gloucester Place. Yes. And he mentioned the number 18 bus earlier. Correct. Williams traced a line on the map with his finger. The number 18 runs along Marylebone Road. If he saw it, he has a view of the Marylebone Road junction, but he also sees Gloucester Place. That puts him on a corner building, high up. He circled a block of buildings. It's this block. Baker Street, York Street, Crawford Street. It has to be. He grabbed the radio mic from the table, bypassing Pringle. This was too urgent for protocol. All units, this is Superintendent Williams. Converge on the block between Baker Street and Gloucester Place. I want a perimeter. Seal the ends of the streets. Do not, repeat, do not enter the buildings yet. I want the perimeter sealed first. If a mouse runs out of a hole, I want a cat waiting for it. The radio burst into a flurry of acknowledgements. Alpha 2 copying. Delta 4 moving to position. Sierra 1 on approach. Williams stood up, his knees cracking. He felt a surge of predatory focus. The hunt was no longer blind. He had a location. Can we go, sir? Pringle asked, sensing the shift in the room. We're going, Williams said, grabbing his raincoat. Rowlands, stay on the set. If they say anything about leaving, if they say anything about weapons, you transmit on the open channel. You warn my men. Me? Rowlands squeaked. But I'm not police. Tonight you are, Williams said. He checked his revolver, spinning the cylinder before snapping it shut. Tonight, everyone is police. He threw the door open and stormed out into the hallway, Pringle at his heels. They took the stairs 2 at a time, the adrenaline finally finding a physical outlet. The rain had intensified, turning the London streets into shimmering black mirrors. Williams' unmarked Rover tore through the wet asphalt, the engine growling. He didn't use the siren, but he drove with a terrifying aggression, weaving through the sparse traffic. As they neared Baker Street, the scene was surreal. Patrol cars were gliding into position at every intersection, their lights off, like sharks circling a reef. Officers were deploying on foot, staying in the shadows of doorways. Williams pulled up to the curb on the corner of Marylebone Road. He stepped out into the rain, the water instantly soaking his hair. Chief Inspector Moore was already there, huddled under an umbrella next to a map spread on the bonnet of a Jaguar. Moore said, his voice battling the sound of the rain. Williams said, looking up at the rooftops. He scanned the skyline. It was a jagged silhouette against the orange glow of the city clouds. Williams ordered, Williams said. At that moment, a young constable ran up to them, breathless. Williams barked. Williams's eyes widened. Williams turned to Moore. He pulled his radio from his belt. Inside the vault, the world had turned orange. The heat was unbearable. The top hinge had finally given way, melting into a puddle of slag. Badger yelled, kicking the lance aside. The professor and Dave jammed the hydraulic spreader into the gap. They pumped the handle furiously. The massive steel door groaned. a sound like a dying wail. The professor gritted his teeth. With a screech of tearing metal, the door swung open. The sight that greeted them was enough to stop their hearts. Walls of brass boxes, millions in cash, jewels, bonds. It was Aladdin's cave. The professor breathed. Suddenly, the radio on the floor screamed. The lookout's voice was frantic, pitched high with terror. The professor froze. The treasure was right there, inches away. He reached out a hand, his fingers brushing the cold metal of a deposit box. Dave shouted, grabbing his shoulder. The professor whispered. Badger roared. He was already retreating to the tunnel entrance, abandoning the heavy lance. Above the sound of the rain, a new sound penetrated the vault. The deep, rhythmic thud of a battering ram hitting the front door of the shop upstairs. Boom, boom, boom. The illusion of invisibility was shattered, the professor said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. He looked at the gold one last time, a king forced to abdicate his throne. They scrambled into the hole in the floor, diving into the earth, just as the sound of splintering wood echoed from above. Williams kicked the door of the shop open, his revolver raised. The shop was empty, filled only with the dust of construction and the smell of raw earth. Shouted the officer behind him. Williams ordered. He moved through the room, his eyes scanning the floor. He saw the rubble, he saw the tools, and then, in the corner, behind a stack of leather satchels, he saw it. The hole. It was a jagged maw in the floorboards, leading down into darkness. Williams said into his radio. He knelt by the hole. He could smell the cordite. He could smell the fear. Williams whispered. The chase had left the airwaves. It had left the streets. Now, it descended into the bowels of the city. The tape in Roland's flat finally ran out, the spool flapping wildly as it spun, a plastic applause for a performance that was far from over. Williams lowered himself into the dark earth. The hunt continued. The reel of magnetic tape spun on the deck, a rhythmic hiss, click, hiss that cut through the cigarette smoke of the makeshift command centre at Scotland Yard. Detective Superintendent Robert Huntley stared at the black plastic spools as if they were the eyes of the criminals themselves. "Play it again," Huntley said. His voice was low, devoid of the panic that was beginning to infect the lower ranks. The technician pressed a button. The room fell silent, save for the static-laden voices emerging from the speaker. "Getting a bit smoky down here. How long with the lance?" "Don't worry about the smoke. Worry about the time. We're through the first layer." Huntley stopped the tape with a raised hand. He turned to the map of London pinned to the corkboard, a sprawling web of streets and districts. The communications officer said, tracing a circle on the map with a grease pencil. Huntley looked at the clock. It was 11 p.m. Saturday night. The city was asleep, but under the pavement, millions of pounds were being siphoned away. Huntley said, buttoning his jacket. He walked to the window, looking out at the rain-slicked pavement of Broadway. Huntley said, turning back to the room. The officer asked. Huntley replied. 26. Robert Rowland sat in the fourth-floor flat on Wimpole Street, the headphones pressing tight against his ears. The small loop antenna on his balcony was wet with rain, swaying slightly in the wind, catching the invisible waves of the robbery in progress. He adjusted the gain on his receiver. The voices were fainter now, buried under the atmospheric noise of the storm. Little bit of movement on the street above, the lookout's voice crackled. "Blue Humber, just passing through." Rowlands looked out his own window. The street below was empty. The lookout wasn't seeing what Rowlands was seeing. That meant the target wasn't on Wimpole Street. The realization tightened his chest. He was the only link, the unauthorized bridge between the crime and the law, and he was blind. He picked up the telephone, dialing the direct line the police had finally given him after hours of skepticism. "This is Rowlands," he said when the line clicked open. "The lookout just reported a blue Humber passing their position. Does that match any of your patrol cars?" "Hold on," the desk sergeant said. Muffled voices exchanged information on the other end. "Negative, Mr. Rowlands. Our cars are in position near Oxford Street. No Humbers." "They aren't where you think they are," Rowlands said, his voice straining with the urgency of the technical limitations. "The signal is skipping. You're looking in the wrong district." "We're casting a wide net, sir. Just keep recording. If they mention a street name, a landmark, anything, you tell us." Rowlands hung up. He watched the spools of his own tape recorder turn. He felt a profound sense of helplessness. He was an expert in radio, a man who understood the physics of wavelengths, yet he could not pinpoint the source of the crime happening in real time. He poured a cup of cold tea and resumed his vigil, a silent witness to a heist that was effectively invisible. The logistical machinery of the Metropolitan Police groaned into gear. It was a procedural monster, clumsy but thorough. In the garage of the police station, engines fired up in unison, the growl of Rovers and Triumphs echoing off the concrete walls. Detective Sergeant Miller sat in the passenger seat of the lead car, a clipboard thick with paper resting on his knees. He checked his watch. 11:45 p.m. "Sector 4, Miller said to the driver, a young constable named Evans. "We have 22 branches on the list. Start with the Midland Bank on Tottenham Court Road." The car rolled out into the rain, the wipers slashing back and forth. They did not use the siren. The blue lights remained dark. The order from Huntley had been explicit. "Stealth is our only advantage." They drove through the deserted streets. London at night was a different city, a labyrinth of shadows and wet stone. They passed the shuttered storefronts, the dark pubs, the empty bus stops. "Here," Miller said. Evans pulled the car to the curb in front of the Midland Bank. The building was imposing, a fortress of granite and iron. Miller stepped out into the rain, his flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. He walked to the front doors. He didn't just look, he acted. He gripped the heavy brass handles and pulled. Locked. Solid. He knelt, shining the light at the base of the doors. No scratches, no dust. He stood and swept the beam over the windows. The grills were intact. Inside, the dim safety light showed a pristine lobby. Miller muttered. He returned to the car, shaking the water from his coat. He drew a line through the first entry on his list. Evans said, shifting gears. Miller replied. The scope of the task was numbing. It wasn't a chase, it was an audit, a systematic elimination of possibilities in a city of millions. They moved from one stone facade to the next, checking locks, checking windows, checking alleyways. At 1 a.m., the radio in Huntley's office crackled with a burst of static that made everyone jump. "Alert! Alert! We have an alarm trip at the Barclays on Regent Street." Huntley spun around. "Is that confirmed?" Silent alarm triggered in the main vault sector. Unit 4 is 2 minutes out. "This matches the timeline," Huntley said, the adrenaline spiking. "They must have breached the inner door. Get the units there, surround the block, but do not, I repeat, do not initiate entry until we have the perimeter sealed." He grabbed the microphone. "All units, converge on Regent Street, code 3, silent approach." The room transformed. The methodical pace of the inspection vanished, replaced by the sharp, kinetic energy of a raid. On the map, the markers were moved, clustering around the new target. Huntley visualized it, the thermal lance cutting through the final layer, the thieves stepping into the gold, and his officers waiting at the top of the stairs. It was the break they needed. 15 minutes later, the radio clicked again. The voice on the other end was breathless, but not from exertion, from disappointment. "Control, this is Unit 4 at Regent Street. We have gained access to the lobby." "Report," Huntley barked. "It's a malfunction, sir. A rat chewed through the wiring in the basement. The vault is secure. There is no sign of entry, no heat signatures, no tools. The bank is empty." Huntley lowered the microphone slowly. The room deflated. The hope had been a mirage, a false lead generated by the chaotic variables of the city itself. "Pull them back," Huntley said, rubbing his temples. "Resume the search patterns. It wasn't Regent Street." He looked back at the tape deck. The thieves were still talking, still drilling. They were ghosts, operating in a parallel dimension that intersected with London only through the radio waves. "We are running out of time," Huntley whispered to himself. "Sunday is coming. If they aren't found by morning, they disappear with the sunrise." The investigation shifted gears from reactive to exhaustive. The radius was expanded. The flying squad, the elite robbery unit, was deployed to the outer rings of the search zone. In the Marylebone district, a dark sedan moved slowly down Baker Street. Inside, Detective Inspector Williams watched the storefront slide by. "We're getting close to the edge of the primary zone," the driver said. "Keep checking," Williams ordered. "The superintendent wants eyes on every lock." They passed a row of shops, a boutique, a restaurant, a leather goods store named Slag. Williams glanced at the shop. The windows were whitewashed, a sign proclaiming "under renovation" taped to the glass. "Slow down," Williams said. He looked at the shop. It was dark, unremarkable, just another business closing down or starting up. There was nothing to suggest it was the throat of a tunnel leading into a bank vault. "Anything?" the driver asked. Williams hesitated. He looked at the leather shop, then at the building next to it. A chicken restaurant. "And 2 doors down, Lloyds Bank," Williams said. "Pull up." The car idled in front of the Lloyds Bank branch at 185 Baker Street. It was a corner building, solid and respectable. The windows were dark. Williams got out. The rain was heavier now, a relentless drizzle that soaked through his trench coat. He approached the bank's main entrance. He went through the ritual. He checked the handles. Locked. He checked the night deposit box. Secure. He peered through the thick glass of the front door. The lobby was empty, the tellers' cages standing like silent sentinels. He walked around to the side alley. High walls, barred windows, no sign of forced entry, no ropes, no ladders. He stood in the alleyway, listening. He expected to hear the hiss of the lance or the rumble of a generator. But there was only the sound of the rain hitting the garbage cans and the distant hum of traffic on Marylebone Road. He placed his hand against the brick wall of the bank, feeling for vibrations. Nothing. The building felt dead, cold, and secure. Williams walked back to the car. He picked up the radio handset. "Control, this is Williams. Baker Street branch inspected. Exterior is secure. No signs of disturbance. Proceeding to the next target." He marked the list. The pen scratched across the paper, leaving a definitive line through Lloyds Bank, Baker Street. "Let's move to the Gloucester Place branch," Williams said, closing the door. The car pulled away, its taillights fading into the mist. Behind them, deep beneath the floorboards of the Slag leather shop, 15 feet through the clay and earth, the tip of a thermal lance flared white-hot, liquefying the reinforced concrete of the vault floor. The radio signal from the tunnel bounced off the wet streets, invisible and silent to the detectives who had stood mere yards away. Back at Scotland Yard, Huntley stared at the map. The number of unchecked banks was shrinking. They had inspected 400 locations, then 500, then 600. The pins on the map were turning from red to green. Cleared, cleared, cleared. And yet, the tape kept spinning. The voices kept talking. "Pass the water, it's getting hot." "Nearly there, I can see the lining." Huntley felt a cold dread settling in his stomach. They were checking the banks, but they were missing something fundamental. "Sir," the communications officer said, "we have a report from a ham operator in the north. He says the signal strength is increasing on the western vector." "The western vector?" Huntley looked at the map. "We just cleared that sector. Williams just checked the Baker Street and Marylebone branches." "He reported them secure, sir." "Then they are inside," Huntley said, the realization hitting him with the force of a physical blow. "They aren't breaking in through the doors. They aren't coming through the roof." He looked at the space between the buildings on the map, the gaps, the basements. "They're coming from underneath," Huntley said. "We're looking for broken locks, but we should be looking for the earth moving." He grabbed the phone. "Get me the plans for the utilities, sewers, cable tunnels, old shelters, and get Williams back on the radio." "Sir?" "Tell him to go back," Huntley ordered, his voice rising. "Tell him to go back to Baker Street. Don't check the bank. Check the shops next to the bank." The order went out through the ether, flying over the sleeping city, racing to catch the car that was driving away from the crime of the century. But on the street, the radio remained silent for a moment, the static hissing like the rain. The car was already blocks away, moving toward the next false negative, leaving the vault door at Baker Street standing tall, imposing, and, to the naked eye, perfectly secure. Inside the Rover, The heater rattled, fighting a losing battle against the damp chill seeping through the door seals. Detective Sergeant Williams rubbed his eyes, the grit of a 14-hour shift scratching against his corneas. Beside him, Constable Reynolds steered the vehicle through the slick, empty curves of Marylebone Road, the tyres hissing on the wet tarmac. "That's the lot for this sector then, Sarge?" Reynolds asked, glancing at the rearview mirror, where the shadowy facade of Baker Street was retreating into the gloom. "My flask is dry, and frankly, so is my patience. If these blokes are cracking a crib tonight, they're doing it invisibly." William sighed, shifting his weight on the vinyl seat. "Huntley's got a bee in his bonnet. The radio traffic says they're definitely active. Somewhere. We aren't seeing it." He lit a cigarette, the flare of the match momentarily illuminating the condensation on the windshield. "It's a needle in a haystack, and the haystack is made of brick and mortar and covers half of London." The radio crackled. It wasn't the rhythmic pulses of the burglars' walkie-talkies that the ham operator had intercepted, but the sharp, authoritative cut of the police frequency. "Car 40, car 40, come in." Reynolds reached for the handset, his movements sluggish with fatigue. 40 receiving. Go ahead, Control. "Turn around, 40. Immediate effect. Return to Baker Street." Williams sat up, the cigarette ash falling unnoticed onto his lapel. The voice on the radio wasn't the dispatcher. It was Huntley himself, distorted by the transmission, but unmistakable in his urgency. Reynolds asked, his foot hovering over the brake. Huntley's voice barked, static clipping the edges of his words. Reynolds slammed on the brakes, his coveted friends. Reynolds slammed on the brakes. Reynolds slammed on the brakes, his coveted friends. Reynolds asked, his foot hovering over the brake. Reynolds barked, static clipping the edges of his words. Reynolds slammed on the brakes, his coveted friends. Reynolds slammed on the brakes, his foot hovering over the brake. Reynolds slammed on the brakes, his coveted friends. Reynolds slammed on the brakes, his foot hovering over the brake. Reynolds slammed on the brakes, his foot hovering over the brake. Huntley's voice barked, static, clipping the edges of his words. Reynolds slammed on the brakes, his foot hovering over the brake. Huntley's voice barked, static, clipping the edges of his words. Reynolds slammed on the brakes, his foot hovering over the brake. Reynolds slammed on the brakes, his foot hovering over the brake. Reynolds slammed on the brakes, his foot hovering over the brake. Reynolds asked, his foot hovering over the brake. Reynolds slammed on the brakes, his foot hovering over the brake. Reynolds slammed on the brakes, his foot hovering over the brake. Huntley's voice barked, static, clipping the edges of his words. Reynolds slammed on the brakes, his foot hovering over the brake. Reynolds slammed on the brakes, his foot hovering over the brake. Reynolds slammed on the brakes, his foot hovering over the brake. Huntley's voice barked, static, clipping the edges of his words. Reynolds slammed on the brakes, his foot hovering over the brake. Reynolds slammed on the brakes, his foot hovering over the brake. Huntley's voice barked, static, clipping the edges of his words. Reynolds slovenly having clipper, his ones to the first floor, on the radio in the room. Reynolds slammed on the brake, his foot hovering over the brake. Huntley's voice barked, static, clipping the edges of his words. Reynolds slammed on the brakes, his foot hovering over the brake. Reynolds slammed on the brakes, his foot hovering over the brake. Reynolds slammed on the brakes, his foot hovering over the brake. Reynolds slammed on the brakes, his foot hovering over the brake. Reynolds slammed on the brakes, his foot hovering over the brake. Reynolds slammed on the brakes, his foot hovering over the brake. Reynolds slammed on the brakes, his foot hovering over the brake. Reynolds slammed on the brakes, his foot hovering over the brake. Reynolds slammed on the brakes, his foot hovering over the brake. Reynolds slammed on the brakes, his foot hovering over the brake. Reynolds slammed on the brakes, his foot hovering over the brake. Reynolds slammed on the brakes, his foot hovering over the brake. Reynolds slammed on the brakes, his foot hovering over the brake. Reynolds slammed on the brakes, his foot hovering over the brake. Reynolds slammed on the brakes, his foot hovering over the brake. Reynolds slammed on the brakes, his foot hovering over the brake. Reynolds slammed on the brakes, his foot hovering over the brake. Reynolds slammed on the brakes, his foot hovering over the brake. Reynolds slammed on the brakes, his foot hovering over the brake. Reynolds slammed on the brakes, his foot hovering over the brake. Reynolds slammed on the brakes, his foot hovering over the brake. Reynolds slammed on the brakes, his foot hovering over the brake. Reynolds slammed on the brakes, his foot hovering over the brake. Reynolds slammed on the brakes, his foot hovering over the brake. Reynolds slammed on the brakes, his foot hovering over the brake. Reynolds slammed on the brakes, his foot hovering over the brake. Reynolds slammed on the brakes, his foot hovering over the brake. Reynolds slammed on the brakes, his foot hovering over the brake. Reynolds slammed on the brakes, his foot hovering over the brake. Reynolds slammed on the brakes, his foot hovering over the brake. Reynolds slammed on the brakes, his foot hovering over the brake. Reynolds slammed on the brakes, his foot hovering over the brake. Reynolds slammed on the brakes, his foot hovering over the brake. Reynolds slammed on the brakes, his foot hovering over the brake. Reynolds slammed on the brakes, his foot hovering over the brake. Reynolds slammed on the brakes, his foot hovering over the brake. Reynolds slammed on the brakes, his foot hovering over the brake. Reynolds slammed on the brakes, his foot hovering over the brake. Reynolds slammed on the brakes, his foot hovering over the brake. Reynolds slammed on the brakes, his foot hovering over the brake. Reynolds slammed on the brakes, his foot hovering over the brake. Reynolds slammed on the brakes. The Rover fishtailed slightly on the wet cobblestones before he wrestled the wheel over, swinging the heavy car around in a tight arc. The headlights swept across the shuttered storefronts of a newsagent and a darkened pub before locking back onto the direction they had just come. Williams muttered, grabbing the dashboard to steady himself. Reynolds said, gunning the engine, the siren remaining silent per the blackout order. 30 feet below the pavement, the world was not cold, nor was it damp. It was an inferno. The air in the tunnel was thick enough to chew, a noxious cocktail of diesel fumes, pulverized clay, and the acrid, metallic tang of vaporized steel. The man holding the thermal lance, a towering figure known to the crew only as the Major, adjusted his goggles. Sweat streamed down his face in rivulets, cutting clean paths through the grime that coated his skin like war paint. The lance was a terrifying instrument. Fed by packed oxygen rods, the tip burned at nearly 3,000 degrees Celsius. It didn't just cut, it obliterated. "Ease up," a voice came from the shadows behind him. It was the frantic whisper of the lookout, the man tasked with monitoring the police frequencies on their own radio setup. The chatter changed. The active car, it stopped moving away. The Major didn't stop. He couldn't. Once the lance was lit, stopping meant losing the temperature, losing the momentum. He pressed the blinding white tip against the underside of the vault floor. The reinforced concrete, designed to withstand drills and explosives, groaned in protest. It bubbled. It turned to grey sludge, dripping down like candle wax, exposing the lattice of thick steel rebar within. "I said, ease up!" The lookout scrambled forward over the mounds of excavated earth, grabbing the Major's shoulder. The lance hissed, a dragon dying, as the Major pulled it back and shut the valve. The sudden silence in the tunnel was deafening, broken only by the heavy, ragged breathing of the 3 men cramped in the hole. "What is it?" the Major growled, lifting his goggles. His eyes were red-rimmed and wild. "We are inches away. I can see the copper lining of the floor." "The coppers," the lookout hissed, pressing the earpiece of his receiver harder against his head. "They turned the car around. They aren't checking the alarms anymore. They're talking specifically about here." A third man, thin and nervous, looked up from where he was bracing the tunnel roof with timber. "They know?" "They don't know," the Major said, though his confidence wavered as he looked at the glowing molten scar above his head. "If they knew, we'd be in cuffs already. They're guessing." "They're guessing damn close," the lookout snapped. They mentioned the shop, the leather shop. Above them, through 15 feet of soil and the wooden floorboards of the basement of Lassac, a car door slammed. The sound was faint, a dull thud that travelled through the ground, but to men running on adrenaline and fear, it sounded like a gavel coming down. "Kill the lights," the the Major whispered. The tunnel plunged into absolute darkness. Detective Williams stood on the pavement outside Slag. The rain had intensified, drumming a relentless rhythm against the brim of his hat. The street was deserted. To his left, the imposing stone facade of Lloyds Bank stood silent, its iron grills locked tight, its alarms humming with invisible, useless electricity. He looked at the shop in front of him, a modest storefront, handbags displayed on tiered stands invisible behind the metal security grate. It looked perfectly innocent, perfectly mundane. "What are we looking for, Sarge?" Reynolds whispered, his hand resting instinctively on his truncheon. Williams didn't answer immediately. He crouched down, putting his face close to the gap at the bottom of the shop's door. He sniffed. The smell of London rain is distinct: wet pavement, coal smoke, the Thames. But beneath that, woven into the draught coming from under the door, was something else. A sharp chemical scent, like a welding shop, like burning money. Williams asked. Reynolds sniffed. Williams stood up, his heart hammering against his ribs. He walked to the side of the shop, peering down into the narrow service alley that ran between the buildings. It was pitch black, a canyon of brick. Williams ordered. Reynolds handed him the heavy torch. Williams clicked it on, sweeping the beam along the wet bricks. Nothing, just rubbish bins and shadows. He moved the beam lower, towards the ground. There was a slight vibration. He could feel it through the soles of his shoes. It wasn't the rumble of the underground trains. They had stopped running hours ago. This was localized, a deep, mechanical thrumming that had suddenly ceased, leaving a phantom sensation in his legs. "Get on the radio," Williams said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Tell Huntley he was right. I want a containment team. I want the dog unit. And get the keys to this shop. Wake up the owner if you have to." "You think they're in there?" Williams looked at the dark window of Slag. He imagined the floorboards inside. He imagined what lay beneath. "No," Williams said grimly. "I don't think they're in the shop. I think they're under it." Back at the yard, the atmosphere in the control room had shifted from frustration to a predatory focus. The map of London, once a sea of overwhelming possibilities, had shrunk to a single pinpoint: 189 Baker Street. Huntley had his jacket off, his tie loosened. He was leaning over the large table where the utility blueprints were spread out like a chaotic quilt. "The sewer line runs here," he traced a blue line with his finger. "It cuts under Marylebone Road and intersects with the old drainage culvert here, behind the buildings." "Sir," the communications officer called out, "Williams requests immediate backup. He has a sensory confirmation. Strange odors and vibration at the target location." Huntley slammed his hand on the table. "I knew it." He looked at the faces around him. Tired detectives, radio operators, map readers. They tunneled. The audacity of it. They rented a shop, probably weeks ago, and they've been digging right under our noses while we checked the front door locks. "Do we breach, sir?" a junior detective asked. Huntley paused. If they breached the shop now, and the gang was still in the tunnel, they might retreat. If the tunnel connected to the sewers, they could vanish into the labyrinth of London's underground infrastructure and pop up in a manhole 3 miles away before the police even found the entrance. "No," Huntley said, his mind racing. "We don't just want to stop them, we want them caught. We need to seal the exits." He turned back to the map. "Identify every manhole cover within a 4-block radius. I want a uniformed officer standing on top of every single one. I want the sewer exits at the Thames watched. And tell Williams to hold position. If he goes in alone, he might spook them into the pipes." "What if they're already in the vault, sir?" Huntley looked at the clock on the wall. It was 3 a.m., Sunday morning. "If they're in the vault," Huntley said quietly, "then they're trapped. They just don't know it yet. But if they're still digging, we have a chance to catch them with the tools in their hands." In the tunnel, the darkness was absolute, but the heat remained. "They're outside," the lookout whispered. "I heard the car door. I heard boots." The Major sat in the dirt, the thermal lance cooling in his grip. The silence stretched, agonizing and thick. Every creak of the timber shoring sounded like a footstep. Every drop of condensation sounded like a shout. "We have to go," the mechanic said, his voice trembling. "Leave the gear. Leave the lance. We back out through the tunnel, hit the sewer junction, and we're gone." "And leave the money?" the major hissed. "We are through, damn you. Another 5 minutes of cutting and that floor drops out. We are standing under millions." "It doesn't matter if we're rich if we're in prison," the mechanic argued, scrambling to pack his bag. "The police are right above us. You heard the radio. They aren't driving away this time." The major stood up, his head brushing the low ceiling of the tunnel. He felt the weight of the decision pressing down on him, heavier than the tons of earth above. He thought of the months of planning, the fake identities, the digging shifts that had left his hands raw and his back broken. To walk away now, with the prize literally inches above his head. He reached up and touched the concrete ceiling. It was hot to the touch. The structural integrity was gone. A few strikes with a sledgehammer might be enough now. "Give me the hammer," the major said. "Are you mad?" the lookout hissed. "They'll hear it." "They already know we're here," the major said, a grim determination settling over him. "Stealth is over. This is now a smash and grab. We break through, we pass the bags down, and we run. We can be out in 10 minutes. They'll have the streets surrounded. But they won't be in the sewer," the major countered. "Not yet. It takes time to organize a perimeter. We have a window, a tiny one." He grabbed the sledgehammer from the mud. He swung it upward. Clang! The sound was shockingly loud in the confined space, ringing like a bell. Above, in the back room of Le Sac, Williams froze. Clang! It came from the floor, a muffled metallic resonance that vibrated through the floorboards. "Did you hear that?" Reynolds whispered, drawing his truncheon. "They're still working," Williams said, disbelief colouring his voice. "The cheeky bastards are still trying to get in." He keyed his radio. "Control, this is Williams. Active noise from the target premises. They are hammering. Repeat, they are hammering. Request permission to breach." The radio crackled back instantly. "Permission granted, Williams. Go, go, go!" Williams didn't hesitate. He raised his boot and kicked the rear door of the shop. The lock, a flimsy residential deadlock, splintered on the first impact. The door flew open. They burst into the shop, flashlight beams cutting through the gloom. It was a chaotic mess of leather hides, shelving units, and dust. But Williams ignored the merchandise. He swept the beam across the floor. There, in the corner, behind a stack of packing crates, the floorboards had been pried up. A dark, gaping hole stared back at them, leading down into the earth. A pile of excavated clay sat next to it, reaching halfway to the ceiling. Reynolds breathed. From the hole, the sound of hammering intensified. Clang, clang, crack! Williams shouted, aiming his flashlight down the shaft. The hammering stopped instantly. For a second, there was silence. Then, a voice floated up from the deep, calm and surprisingly polite. Williams blinked. With the tempers had ordered. He had voted in a first with a first number. He know that he would fault, the voice replied. He voted in the first with a first number. He was faced, mo farm. He doesn't. There was a first many. He had voted in the first with a first number. There was scuffling sound, the scraping of heavy bags, and then the distinct splash of bodies hitting water. Reynolds yelled. Reynolds licked at him. Williams looked at the hole. It was narrow, shored up with rough timber, and smelled like hell itself. He looked at his clean uniform, then at Reynolds. Williams said, unbuttoning his heavy wool coat. Williams said, grabbing the edge of the pit. He lowered himself into the shaft. The air grew instantly hotter. He dropped 5 feet, then 10, his boots finding purchase on the rough earthen walls. When he hit the bottom of the tunnel, the heat from the thermal lance hit him like a physical blow. The tunnel was empty, save for the glowing equipment left behind. The lance, tanks of oxygen, and a sledgehammer lay in the mud. At the far end of the tunnel, a jagged hole had been smashed into the side of the brick sewer wall. Williams scrambled on his hands and knees, crawling through the claustrophobic burrow the thieves had dug. He reached the sewer breach and shone his light into the vast, echoing darkness of the Victorian drain. To his left, ripples disturbed the black water. He swung the beam. 50 yards away, 3 figures were wading through the thigh-deep sludge, moving fast. 421, Williams shouted, his voice echoing weirdly off the curved brickwork. The figures didn't stop. They didn't even look back. They rounded a bend in the sewer and vanished. Williams keyed his radio, praying the signal would punch through the brick and earth. Above ground, the City of London woke up. Sirens began to wail from every direction, weaving a web of noise around Baker Street. Blue lights flashed against the buildings, shattering the misty gloom. Huntley stood at the window of his office, looking out at the city. He could hear the sirens even from here. The radio officer reported. Huntley nodded slowly. He walked back to the map. He picked up a red marker and drew a circle around the block containing the bank. He stared at it for a long moment. They had almost done it. If the ham operator hadn't been listening, if he hadn't realized the flaw in the search pattern, they would have emptied the vault and vanished into the earth, leaving nothing but a hole in the floor and a mystery for the ages. Quote 426, the officer said, breaking his reverie. Quote 427. Huntley froze. Quote 428. Quote 429. Huntley let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. A smile, thin and tired, touched his lips. Secure the scene, Huntley said. I want forensics down that hole before the sun comes up. And get Williams a medal, or at least a dry uniform. He looked at the map one last time. The red pins, the green pins. The game was over. But deep down, in the silent corners of his mind, Huntley knew this wasn't just a robbery. It was a legend in the making. The walkie-talkie bank job, the night the earth moved under Baker Street. He picked up his tea. It was cold, but he drank it anyway. Huntley said to the empty room. Outside, the rain finally stopped, leaving London glistening under the streetlights, while deep beneath the pavement, the echo of footsteps faded into the endless, labyrinthine dark of the city's bowels. The vault door at Lloyds Bank stood tall and imposing, its secrets safe, but its invincibility shattered forever. Detective Superintendent Huntley stepped through the smashed glass door of the leather goods shop on Baker Street, his boots crunching on shards that caught the flashing blue lights from the street. The sign above the door read, Le Sac, a modest storefront nestled 2 doors down from the Chicken Inn. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of cured hide and expensive handbags, but beneath that lay a sharper, earthier smell, the damp, heavy odour of deep clay and standing water. Uniformed officers were already dismantling the rear of the shop. A heavy display cabinet, filled with purses and belts, had been dragged away from the back wall. Behind it, the plasterboard had been cut away to reveal not brick, but a gaping darkness. "Mind your step, sir," Williams said, his face smeared with grime. "The floor stability is questionable near the aperture." Huntley approached the opening. It wasn't just a hole, it was a feat of engineering. The shop floor had been excavated with precision, revealing a vertical shaft descending 8 feet into the basement foundations. He shone his heavy torch into the void. At the bottom of the shaft, the beam caught the dull reflection of wet timber. Huntley said, his voice flat. Williams confirmed, consulting a clipboard. Huntley lowered himself onto the ladder the constables had secured. The descent took him out of the sterile world of the shop and into the humid, claustrophobic reality of the robbery. The tunnel was narrow, barely wide enough for a man to crawl, yet the perpetrators had moved tons of earth through this artery. As he crouched and moved forward, the beam of his light played over the sides of the tunnel. He noted the spade marks in the clay, preserved perfectly in the damp earth, a testament to weeks of silent, back-breaking labour performed right beneath the feet of pedestrians. The tunnel ended abruptly at a wall of concrete, the floor of the Lloyds Bank vault. Here, the violence of the entry was undeniable. The concrete had been bored through, but not with drills alone. The edges of the breach were glazed and black. Huntley muttered. He touched the rim of the hole. It was cold now, but the devastation suggested temperatures exceeding 2,500 degrees Celsius. They had melted their way in. He pushed himself up through the breach, entering the vault itself. The silence of the strong room was heavy, amplified by the thick steel walls designed to keep the world out. His torch swept the room. Huntley called out, his voice echoing slightly. Came the muffled reply from the tunnel below. Huntley moved the light across the rows of safety deposit boxes lining the walls. It was a scene of systematic destruction. The main cash reserves might have been untouched, but the private boxes, the repositories of secrets, jewellery, and untraceable bonds, had been decimated. Drawer after drawer had been forced open. Metal tongues hung loose. Lock cylinders lay scattered on the floor like spent shell casings. The floor was carpeted in paper, deeds, wills, photographs, documents the thieves deemed worthless and discarded in their haste. Huntley corrected, kneeling to examine a discarded velvet jewellery box. It was empty. He stood up, the initial relief of the capture washing away, replaced by the grim weight of the procedural task ahead. This wasn't a failed attempt. It was a successful extraction, interrupted only at the final second. The radio silence had been their undoing, but the physical execution was nearly flawless. "Get the photographers down here," Huntley commanded. "I want every inch of this floor grid-mapped before a single piece of paper is moved. And tell forensics I want the thermal lance bagged. They left it behind." The sun rose over London, casting a pale, grey light over Baker Street. The cordon had been expanded. The procedural machinery of the Metropolitan Police was now in full gear, moving with the slow, inexorable momentum of a tide. Robert Rowlands sat in his flat, staring at his radio receiver. The 27 MHz band was silent now, save for the static and the occasional distant trucker. The voices were gone. He hadn't slept. The tea on his desk had developed a skin. A knock at the door made him jump. He opened it to find two men in raincoats. They didn't need to introduce themselves. The erratic beating of his heart told him exactly who they were. "Mr. Robert Rowlands?" the taller one asked. "Yes." "Detective Sergeant Everson, Baker Street Inquiry. We understand you're the one who provided the tapes." Rowlands nodded, stepping back to let them in. He felt a sudden irrational spike of guilt, the fear that his unauthorized interception of signals would be the focus. I tried to call sooner. I didn't know if it was real." Everson looked around the flat, his eyes landing on the complex array of radio equipment, the antennas, the tape recorder. He walked over and inspected the device. "You have a good ear, Mr. Rowlands," Everson said, his tone neutral, "and a better sense of direction than our engineers initially gave you credit for." "Did you catch them?" Rowlands asked. "We secured the scene. The investigation is ongoing." Everson turned. "We need a formal statement. We need you to walk us through the timeline of the transmissions. Every time you heard the drilling stop, every time the lookout spoke. It matches the progress of the tunnel." Rowlands sat at his small table, his hands trembling slightly as he clasped them. "They were talking about the smoke," he said softly. "Last night. They were worried about the fumes from the lance." "Yes," Everson said, pulling out a notebook. "The thermic lance. It requires oxygen cylinders. We found those too. Tell us about the voices." As Rowlands began to speak, recounting the invisible drama he had witnessed from miles away, the detective wrote with methodical precision. The intersection of a hobbyist's curiosity and a criminal's ambition was being transcribed into evidence. Rowlands was no longer just a listener. He was the primary witness to a crime that had taken place in the dark. Back inside the vault, the air quality was poor. The smell of acetylene and burnt metal lingered, a chemical ghost haunting the room. The forensic team moved in white suits, silent and respectful of the scene. The inventory process began. It was a tedious, manual labour. There were 268 safety deposit boxes that had been tampered with. Each one had to be photographed, dusted for fingerprints, and catalogued. Huntley stood by the breach, watching the recovery of the tools. This was the turning point of the investigation, from the frantic search for a location to the microscopic search for identity. A forensic technician lifted a heavy, cylindrical object from the debris near the tunnel exit. It was a thermal lance holder, attached to hosing that snaked back down into the tunnel. "Standard industrial make," the technician noted, placing it into a large evidence bag. "But look at this." He pointed to a heavy-duty hydraulic jack, painted red, lying on its side amidst the scattered papers. 5-ton capacity, Huntley observed. "Used to spread the bars or brace the tunnel?" "Brace the tunnel roof, most likely. It's got clay on the base plate. But here's the interesting part, sir. It's quite new. Barely a scratch on the paint." "Trace it," Huntley said. "Whatever shop sold that jack remembers the face that bought it. People don't buy 5-ton jacks for household repairs." The search continued. They found a walkie-talkie, discarded in the tunnel. It was a cheap unit, modification evident on the antenna coil to boost the range. This was the device that had broadcast their movements to Rowlands, the fatal flaw in their security. But the most significant discovery came from the debris pile itself. Inside the tunnel, mixed with the clay, was a crumpled paper bag. Inside were not jewels or cash, but the remnants of their sustenance: food wrappers, empty water bottles, and a receipt. It was faint, illegible to the naked eye under the harsh work lights, but the forensic document examiner nodded slowly. "We can bring this up in the lab. Infrared video verification. If there's ink there, we'll read it." Huntley looked at the gaping hole in the floor. The audacity of it was staggering. They had rented the shop, Le Sac, months ago. They had posed as legitimate businessmen. They had drilled on weekends, timing their noise to match the traffic on Baker Street. They had calculated the distance to the vault with geometric perfection. "Who leases Le Sac?" Huntley asked the sergeant coordinating the surface team. "A Mr. Benjamin Wolfe," the sergeant replied. "Signed the lease in May, paid strictly in cash. We're pulling his records now." "Wolfe," Huntley tested the name. "Put a net out. Ports, airports, train stations. If he signed the lease, he's the anchor." The weeks that followed saw the forensic narrative tighten like a noose. The investigation shifted from the adrenaline of the Intercept to the slow, grinding bureaucracy of justice. The Le Sac lease led to Benjamin Wolfe. He was a known associate of several figures in the London underworld, men who specialized in heavy machinery and alarm bypasses. The police didn't rush. They watched. They mapped the network of associates. The thermal lance was traced to a supplier in East London. The receipt found in the tunnel, once subjected to electrostatic detection analysis, revealed a purchase of specific scaffolding clips from a hardware store in Southwark. One by one, the faces of the gang were pinned to the corkboards in Scotland Yard. Anthony Gavin, a photographer with a history of forceful entries. Thomas Stevens, a car dealer with the logistical capacity to move equipment. Reginald Tucker, the company director who provided the veneer of legitimacy. They were arrested in a series of coordinated raids, pulled from their beds or intercepted in their vehicles. They went quietly, the resignation of professionals who knew the gamble had failed. The recovery of the loot was less successful. While the tools were abundant, the contents of the 268 boxes had largely vanished into the ether. Cash, untraceable diamonds, bearer bonds, items that could be fenced or laundered, were gone. Only the sentimental items, the papers and the cheap trinkets, remained on the vault floor. The trial was a somber affair. The prosecution laid out the timeline with the same methodical pacing as the tunnel's construction. They played the tapes Rowlands had recorded. The courtroom listened in silence to the static-filled voices of the men sitting in the dock, hearing their own whispers plotting the breach. "Look out to base. Coast is clear." The disconnect between the grainy audio and the men in suits was jarring. It was the first time in British legal history that radio intercepts of this nature played such a pivotal role. The judge's sentencing was severe, reflecting the sophistication and the threat to the banking infrastructure. "This was not an opportunistic crime," the judge intoned, looking over his spectacles at the defendants. "This was a siege, a calculated, industrial assault on the concept of security itself." Gavin, Tucker, Stevens and Wolfe received 12 years each. The investigation had closed the loop. The walkie-talkie bank job was officially solved. Months later, Huntley returned to Baker Street. The shop, Le Sac, was boarded up, a "To Let" sign once again affixed to the brickwork. The pavement outside was busy with shoppers, unaware of the labyrinth that had existed beneath their feet. He walked to the corner, looking down towards the bank. The vault had been repaired. The floor was reinforced with fresh concrete and steel mesh, a scar hidden deep underground. Huntley thought about the thermal lance. The sheer heat required to burn through that much reinforced concrete was immense. It wasn't just brute force. It was chemistry. It was physics. They had understood the city better than the city understood itself. They knew the soil composition of Baker Street. They knew the depth of the sewers. They knew the frequency of the police patrols. He took a cigarette from his silver case and tapped it against the lid. The tools they left behind, the jack, the lance, the batteries, were now tagged and sitting in an evidence locker. But the method would be studied. By the police, certainly, but also by others. The radio silence had saved the bank's remaining reserves, but the tunnel proved something dangerous, that the fortress was permeable. Huntley lit the cigarette and exhaled a plume of smoke into the cold London air. "Smart lads," he whispered, a reluctant admission of professional respect, just not smart enough to stay off the airwaves. He turned and walked away, the collar of his coat turned up against the wind. The case was closed, the evidence filed. But as he walked, he couldn't shake the image of the tunnel, that perfect, timber-shored corridor running through the dark, a secret vein in the body of London that had almost bled the city dry. They had failed, yes, but they had forced the world to look down and realize that the ground beneath was not as solid as it seemed. The thought lingered, heavy as the damp wool of his coat. It was a destabilizing realization, one that made the pavement beneath his brogues feel less like stone and more like a thin crust over a hollow earth. Huntley moved away from the scene, merging into the stream of commuters rushing toward the Baker Street tube station, their heads down, newspapers tucked under arms, oblivious to the fact that they were walking over a battlefield. He needed a drink. Not the celebratory scotch of a victory parade, but the brooding, medicinal pint of a man who had seen the mechanics of the world stripped bare and didn't quite like the look of the gears. He ducked into the Volunteer, a pub that smelled of stale tobacco, wet dog, and the deep, resinous polish of old wood. It was a policeman's pub, or at least a place where the law came to loosen its tie. He ordered a bitter and found a booth in the back, away from the frosted windows that glowed with the diffuse yellow light of the street lamps. He hadn't been sitting long when Detective Sergeant Miller slid into the seat opposite him. Miller was younger, sharper in his dress but softer in the eyes. He had served on the perimeter of the Baker Street job, handling the cordon when they finally cracked the door to Le Sac. Miller asked, sliding a packet of players across the table. Huntley took one, nodding his thanks. Miller said, striking a match. The flare illuminated the tiredness etched into his face. Huntley replied, leaning into the flame. Miller exhaled, the smoke drifting up to mingle with the yellowed ceiling. Huntley swirled his beer, watching the foam cling to the glass. Miller said, lowering his voice, as if the very mention of it might summon the ghosts of the Intercept. Huntley nodded slowly. This was the crux of the unease that had settled in his gut. The quote, 495, wasn't just a crime, it was a pivot point. The era of the brute was ending. The era of the technician had begun. "It's the silence that kills you," Huntley murmured. "We got them because they talked, because they were arrogant enough to think the air was theirs. But imagine, Miller, imagine the next lot, the ones who learn from Gavin and Tucker, the ones who buy the radios, buy the lances, buy the maps, but keep their mouths shut. How do we catch a ghost that doesn't rattle its chains?" Miller shuddered slightly, taking a long pull of his drink. "Don't say that. I've got 15 years left on the force. I don't want to spend them chasing phantoms." "We won't have a choice," Huntley said, finishing his glass. "The game has changed. We're not just looking for fingerprints and footprints anymore. We're looking for frequencies." He stood up, buttoning his coat. "I'm going back to the yard. There's paperwork on the evidence disposal. I want to make sure that thermal lance is buried deeper than the gold ever was." The drive to Scotland Yard was a blur of rain-slicked streets and the metronomic sweep of windshield wipers. London was weeping, a cold, indifferent drizzle that washed the soot from the curbs, but did nothing to cleanse the moral grime. Huntley parked his Austin in the designated bay and walked up the steps, the stone facade of the headquarters looming like a fortress of its own. Inside, the station was humming with the low-level energy of the night shift. Telephones rang in distant rooms, a typewriter clacked rhythmically like a frantic heartbeat, and the air smelled of floor wax and stewed tea. Huntley navigated the corridors to the evidence storage. It was a cage, really, a vast room partitioned by chain-link fencing filled with the debris of human sin. Stolen bicycles, bloodied cricket bats, bags of counterfeit notes, and rows of files that detailed the misery of the metropolis. The quartermaster, a man named Hedges, who possessed the skeletal frame and dusty demeanour of a crypt keeper, looked up from his ledger. "Inspector Huntley, to what do I owe the pleasure? Come to reclaim a lost umbrella?" "The Baker Street Hall," Huntley said, leaning on the counter. "I want to see the hardware." Hedges raised an eyebrow but didn't argue. He unhooked a heavy ring of keys and led Huntley down the central aisle, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. They stopped at a large open bay near the back. There it was, the anatomy of the heist. The thermal lance lay on a workbench, looking innocuous now that it was cold. It was essentially a long pipe, packed with steel rods. But Huntley knew that when oxygen was pumped through it and ignited, it burned at temperatures that could melt rock. It was a dragon's throat, severed and tagged with a cardboard label. Exhibit A14. Next to it sat the heavy-duty jack, capable of exerting tons of pressure. And then, the walkie-talkies. Huntley picked one up. It was heavy, encased in metal and bakelite. A simple device, a toy almost. Yet, it had been the nerve center of the operation. He ran his thumb over the speaker grill. It was silent now, but he could almost hear the ghosts of the robbers' voices, the crackle of static, the lookout on the roof warning of approaching patrols. "Coppers at the corner. Stay low." He set it down. "We had a man from the War Office in earlier," Hedges remarked, leaning against a stack of crates. "Interested in the lance, said it was military grade, wondered where a bunch of East End boys got their hands on it." "Did he get an answer?" "Not a useful one. Surplus, they said. Fell off a lorry." The usual lie. "But the oxygen tanks, those were industrial, stolen from a welding supply in Bermondsey 2 weeks prior." "The planning, Huntley. It's the planning that scares me. They collected this stuff like they were building a house." Huntley stared at the lance. "They were building a legend, Hedges, and we helped them write the ending." "Did we?" Hedges gestured to a smaller box. "We never recovered the full amount, you know. The bank's audit is still fuzzy. They say it's all accounted for, mostly, but there's always a discrepancy. A few grand here, a few grand there. Maybe fell into the rubble, maybe burned up." Huntley looked at him sharply. "Or maybe mailed to a safe address before the net closed." "Maybe," Hedges shrugged. "But the men are in the scrubs. If there's money waiting for them, it'll have to wait 12 years. Inflation will eat half of it by then." Huntley turned away from the cage. The sight of the tools didn't bring him the closure he expected. Instead, it reinforced the feeling of industrialization. Crime was no longer a matter of passion. It was a matter of logistics. Huntley said. 18. Huntley left the yard and found himself driving aimlessly. He wasn't ready for the silence of his flat in Kensington. He needed noise. He needed the static. He found himself parked on Wimpole Street, outside the flat of Mr. Robert Rowlands, the ham radio enthusiast, the man who had been the unintended ear of God, listening in on the robbers when the police had been deaf. It was late, past 11, but a light still burned in the upper window. Huntley hesitated, then got out of the car. He rang the bell. A moment later the door buzzed, and he ascended the stairs. Rowlands met him at the door, wearing a dressing gown and looking perplexed. "Inspector Huntley? Is everything all right? Has there been a reprisal?" The man's fear was palpable. He was a civilian who had stumbled into a war zone. "No, nothing like that, Mr. Rowlands. My apologies for the hour. I was nearby. I just wanted to verify a detail for the final report." It was a lie, and they both knew it. Huntley wanted to see the radio again. Rowlands ushered him in. The flat was cosy, cluttered with books and the smell of pipe tobacco. But the centerpiece was the desk in the corner, dominated by the radio receiver, a hulking mass of dials, valves and wires. "I haven't listened much since the trial," Rowlands admitted, pouring Huntley a cup of tea from a pot that was still warm. "It feels different now, less like a hobby, more like voyeurism." Huntley walked over to the machine. "You saved the bank's reputation, Mr. Rowlands, and you saved us from looking like fools." "I just turned a dial," Rowlands said modestly. "I was looking for music, or chatter from the ships in the channel. I didn't expect to hear men discussing how to cut through steel." "That night," Huntley said, tracing the curve of the tuning knob, "when you first heard them, what was the quality of the signal?" "Clear," Rowlands said, his eyes lighting up with technical enthusiasm. "Surprisingly clear. They were using a frequency close to the emergency bands. That's why nobody else picked it up. It was a narrow corridor of the spectrum. If I hadn't drifted, I would have missed it." "A narrow corridor," Huntley repeated, "like the tunnel." "Exactly. Electronic tunneling. They were burrowing through the airwaves just as they were burrowing through the clay." Huntley looked at the man. "Do you think there are others? Right now? On other frequencies?" Rowlands looked at the radio, then back at Huntley. "Inspector, the air is full of voices. Thousands of them. Spies, lovers, taxi dispatchers, ships, planes. It's a cacophony. We only hear what we tune into. The scary part isn't that they were transmitting. It's that for everyone we catch, there are 100 speaking in codes we haven't broken, on frequencies we aren't monitoring." Huntley felt a chill that had nothing to do with the drafty window. "We need better ears," he whispered. "You need 1,000 ears," Rowlands corrected, "and even then, you'll miss the whispers." Huntley finished his tea in silence. He thanked Rowlands and left, the sound of the door latching behind him echoing like a cell door closing. The following week brought a different kind of cold. A frost had settled over London, turning the parks into brittle, white landscapes. The newspapers had finally moved on from the bank job, replaced by political scandals and cricket scores. But for Huntley, the file remained open on his mental desk. He had a meeting with Commander Wilkes, a man whose office was so large it required its own weather system. Wilkes was old school, leather chairs, brandy at lunch, and a belief that a truncheon was the ultimate problem solver. "Huntley," Wilkes barked as the inspector entered. "Sit down. You look like you've been sleeping in a coal bunker." "Just tired, sir. The wrap-up on the Baker Street case is extensive." "It's done." Wilkes waved a hand dismissively. "Convictions secured. Public reassured. The Bank of England has sent a letter of commendation. You should be pleased. Why aren't you pleased?" "Because we got lucky, sir." Wilkes paused, his cigar halfway to his mouth. "Luck is a part of police work, Huntley. Napoleon wanted lucky generals. I want lucky detectives." "We can't rely on ham radio enthusiasts next time," Huntley pressed. "I've been looking at the budget. We need a dedicated communications unit. We need scanning equipment. We need to be able to triangulate signals within minutes, not hours. The villains are using military surplus. We're using whistles and notebooks." Wilkes sighed, leaning back. "You want toys, Huntley. Expensive toys." "I want parity, sir. They used a thermal lance. Do you know what that implies? It implies an understanding of metallurgy and combustion that rivals our forensic labs. They had lookouts with radios. They had a structured command hierarchy. We are fighting a modernized enemy with Victorian tactics. And you think spending £10,000 on radios will fix that? It's a start. If we don't control the airwaves, we lose the streets." Wilkes stared at him for a long moment, the smoke from his cigar curling into question marks. "I'll authorize a review, that's all. A review. If you can convince the bean counters that a walkie-talkie is as essential as a handcuff, you can have your unit." "Thank you, sir." "But Huntley," Wilkes added, his voice dropping an octave, "don't let this case haunt you. You caught them. That's the job. Don't go looking for monsters in the static. You'll go mad." "I'm not looking for monsters, sir," Huntley said, standing up. "I'm looking for the men who control them." Huntley's obsession led him inevitably to the underbelly. Not the violent thugs of the East End, but the technicians. The fences who specialized in difficult items. The mechanics who modified getaway cars. He sought out a man known as Sparky Davies. Sparky ran a repair shop in Shoreditch that fixed televisions and radios and occasionally repaired things that, strictly speaking, shouldn't exist. The shop was a chaotic warren of cathode ray tubes, copper wire and soldering irons. The air smelled of ozone and burnt flux. Sparky was hunched over a circuit board, a magnifying glass strapped to his forehead. Sparky said without looking up. Sparky put down his soldering iron and pushed the magnifying glass up. He had the pale, watery eyes of a man who spent too much time squinting at resistors. Huntley said. Huntley leaned in. Sparky said with a sneer. Sparky hesitated. He picked up a rag and wiped his hands. Huntley said, "This men in the dock, Gavin, Tucker, Stevens, Wolfe, they were capable, yes, but the lance required finesse," Sparky said. Huntley mused. Huntley dropped a 10-shilling note on the bench. Sparky grimaced. The weeks turned into months. The sign on Le Sac was eventually replaced. A haberdashery moved in. Life plastered over the wound. The reinforced floor of the vault was covered with linoleum, and stacks of cash were once again piled high, trusting in the thickness of the walls. Huntley found himself working a string of domestic burglaries in Chelsea, standard fare, smashed windows, and stolen silverware. It was mundane, comforting police work. But every time he keyed the microphone on his patrol car, he felt a flicker of that old anxiety. One evening, deep in winter, he received a call from the prison governor at Wormwood Scrubs. It was regarding Mr. Wolfe. Huntley arrived the next morning. The prison was a Victorian monolith, smelling of cabbage and disinfectant. He was led to a small interview room. Wolfe sat on the other side of the table, wearing the grey uniform of the convict. He looked thinner, but his eyes were bright, intelligent. Wolfe said, his voice calm. Huntley said, placing his hat on the table. Wolfe smiled. It was a tight, guarded smile. We said, "We're having a few minutes going off." Huntley leaned back, which was cool, Wolfe said softly. Huntley paused. He hadn't checked the detail. The conviction history had been enough. Sapper, was it? That's right. We blew bridges, mostly. But we learned how to cut through anything. Steel, concrete, ice. The principle is always the same. Apply enough energy to a focused point, and the structure fails. Wolfe leaned forward, his eyes locking onto Huntley's. You want to know the mistake we made? It wasn't the radio. It wasn't the lookout. It was greed. We spent too long in there. If we'd taken half the loot and left an hour earlier, your Mr. Rowlands would have been listening to static when he tuned in. Greed is usually the mistake, Huntley agreed. But the method... Wolfe's eyes drifted past Huntley, looking at the bare wall as if seeing a blueprint. The method was sound. We proved that the city is hollow. You walk around up there thinking you're on solid ground. You're not. You're walking on a honeycomb. Sewers, tube lines, utility tunnels, basements, forgotten bunkers. London is more air than earth, Inspector. We just found a way to navigate the negative space. And the radio? A necessity. You can't run cables through a sewer without attracting attention. We needed to be wireless. It was the future. We were just early adopters. Huntley stood up. He had his answer. There was no secret mastermind, just a man who had taken the skills of war and applied them to peacetime plunder. 12 years is a long time, Wolfe. Technology moves fast. By the time you get out, that radio of yours will be a museum piece. The banks will have electronic eyes, lasers, computers. Wolfe shrugged. Then I'll learn those too. I've got nothing but time. Or, Huntley said, pausing at the door, you could build that bridge, the one you didn't build. Wolfe looked at his hands. Maybe. But bridges are boring, Inspector. Everyone knows where a bridge goes. A tunnel. A tunnel goes wherever you want it to. Huntley walked out of the prison and into the grey afternoon. The conversation with Wolfe had settled something in him. The fear of the phantom mastermind was gone, replaced by a grudging acceptance of the reality. The criminal was evolving. The thief was becoming a scientist. He drove back to central London, the traffic thickening as rush hour approached. He turned on the car radio. A newsreader was speaking in clipped tones about the crisis in the Suez, followed by a pop song with a jaunty, defiant beat. Huntley turned the dial. Static. A whine of interference. Then, a burst of voice. A taxi dispatcher sending a cab to Notting Hill. Another turn. A maritime weather report. The air was alive. Rowlands was right. It was a cacophony of invisible threads connecting the city. He parked near the Thames, looking out over the water. The sun was setting, casting a bruised purple light over the skyline. He saw the city differently now. He didn't just see the buildings, he saw the voids beneath them. He didn't just hear the traffic, he heard the frequencies cutting through the air. The walkie-talkie bank job was solved. The file was closed. But Huntley knew that the siege wasn't over. It had just changed battlefields. The walls of the fortress were no longer made of stone. They were made of signal encryption and electronic countermeasures. He lit a cigarette, the flame flaring bright against the encroaching dusk. He thought of the thermal lance, burning at 3,000 degrees in the dark. He thought of the sheer, terrifying ingenuity of it. Industrial assault, the judge had called it. Huntley exhaled smoke, watching it dissipate into the ether. Evolution, Huntley corrected, speaking to no one but the river. It was evolution. He flicked the cigarette butt into the water. It hissed and vanished. Tomorrow, he would push again for the communications unit. He would badger Wilkes until they got the budget. He would learn about frequencies. He would learn about triangulation. He would read the manuals that Wolfe read. Because the ground was not solid, the air was not empty, and if he wanted to protect the city, he had to learn to see in the dark and listen to the silence. Huntley turned his collar up against the wind and walked back to his car. The city was waiting, and somewhere, in a garage or a basement or a bedroom, the next Wolfe was already turning the page of a textbook, looking for the next weak point in the world. And Huntley intended to be there when they found it.